Hey class, welcome back to Introductory Psychology, Chapter 2 of the King Introductory Psychology text. Chapter 1 was more of a kind of a historical overview where psychology comes from, defining psychology, where it's going, looking at some of the modern perspectives, kind of looking at the research side of things. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the role of the nervous system and the endocrine system, how those play into explaining thoughts and behavior. So a lot of this chapter will be pretty anatomy heavy. So maybe if you've taken a course on like biology, zoology, anatomy, or something along those lines, or if you've studied nerve cells or anything like that, then probably a large degree of this chapter will be review, but hopefully it will be within a new context of trying to understand psychology. So this chapter is broken up into, I believe, 6 different sections. We'll talk about the nervous system first. We'll kind of look at it holistically. Then we'll break it down into its smallest parts by looking at neurons. Then we'll look at a specific aspect of the nervous system, which is the brain. Very large collections of neurons, very, very important to human survival, or really the survival of any species. We'll talk about the endocrine system, which is a slower way at which the body communicates with itself. We'll talk about some interesting phenomena related to brain damage, plasticity, and repair. And then finally, we'll finish up by looking at the role that genetics plays when it comes to behavior. So to begin with, we're talking about the nervous system, and the nervous system, encompasses not just the brain, but it's the spinal cord, the brain, and all of the nerves in our body. And there are some defining features of the nervous system. For one, it's very complex, especially when we're talking about the human nervous system, very complex, very integrated, meaning all of these interconnected complex parts are kind of working together. And immediately it makes you think of, that misconception that we only use 10% of our brain. I mean, everything is just sort of integrated and being used, and even some of the most simplest of tasks. So it's all working, all integrated, very complex. Also, the nervous system is very adaptable, a term that we sometimes use interchangeably with plasticity, meaning it is moldable it's adaptable to experience. And then we're talking about electrochemical transmission. When we say that nerve cells fire, when they're relaying messages throughout the body, what we're talking about is the transmission of electrochemical energy. Your brain, for example, has enough electrical chemical energy in it to power a light bulb. Obviously, we can't just plug a light bulb into our head, so it's not quite that simple, but there literally is electricity going on inside your brain and throughout your nerves, spinal cord, etc., and on any kind of task we do. So we're talking about, the nervous system. We're talking about how we, the nervous system really is a form of communication. It is carrying information from the body to the brain, and sometimes from the brain to the body. So when we have afferent neurons, these are the kinds of neurons that relay signals from the body to the brain. Versus efferent neurons, where we have signals being sent from the brain to the body. And you can kind of see how these two things work interchangeably. So for example, if you reach out and touch a hot stove, your body, your hand is going through afferent neurons, are going to send signals to the brain. Oh, wow, this is hot. And the efferent neurons will immediately relay that signal back saying, oh, move your hand. It's, you don't have to sit there and like hold your hand and think about it and go, oh my gosh, this is hot. What should I ever do? That process happens very quickly, but it's kind of that two-way street between efferent nerve cells or neurons that are communicating from the body to the brain and to the brain to the body. So we have these different kinds of nerve cells throughout the skin, throughout the muscle, throughout the muscles, and these allow us to know when to move. It allows our body to coordinate movement, especially even simple and even complex movement. So when we think about the nervous system even further, we can divide it into different sections. We have the central nervous system, which it's comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. And it makes sense. Like if you draw a line right down the human anatomy, right smack dab in the center is your brain and your spinal cord, which is different from the peripheral nervous system, which is on the periphery, on the edges, on the outer parts of the nervous system. It divides into the somatic nervous system, which you use to control voluntary muscle movement, like the fact that I can move my arms right now and I can, mess around with this mouse. I'm using the somatic nervous system. We have sensory nerves, we have motor nerves, afferent nerves we just talked about. You have the autonomic nervous system, which regulates involuntary muscle movement. So, for example, your heartbeat. There's things you can do to regulate your heartbeat, like you can breathe in or breathe out faster or slower to kind of make your heart speed up. But we don't consciously control our heartbeat. We don't consciously control our digestive tract. That is governed and regulated by the autonomic nervous system. It's the internal organs, the muscles that we don't have to consciously control. And that further subdivides into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system regulates the experience of fight or flight. Parasympathetic regulates the experience of rest and digest. So when you encounter some kind of stressor in your environment, your body reacts physiologically and goes into fight or flight. And then once the stressor is removed, you've had a chance to calm down, you go into fight or rest and digest through the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is kind of breaking that all visually. So we have the central nervous system here, the spinal cord, the brain. We're going to talk about the various parts of the brain later on. We have the peripheral nervous system here, somatic, autonomic. So, these visual aids are pretty good, a good way of kind of, visually seeing where and how the differences take place. Okay, so now we're going to get into kind of the nitty gritty, the fine, like so far we just kind of looked at the macro, the nervous system. Now we're going to look at the smaller, the nervous system broken down into its smallest elements, which are nerve cells or neurons. There are different kinds of neurons. You have glial cells. If you're a fan of like F1 racing or NASCAR or IndyCar or stuff like that, glial cells are kind of like the pit crew on a race team. They provide support and nutrition. They clean up waste. They do all the things to make sure that other neurons can function appropriately. In the brain itself, we have about 100 billion neurons, and these again are just nerve cells, and they're all interconnected. Probably a little, actually, we found out it's probably a little less than 100 billion, but pretty close if you want to round up. And these neurons are used for information processing. We compute information we encounter in our environment. We use that to communicate back to others, or anyway. And specializing neurons, I think we'll talk about this in chapter 4. We also, especially in primates, you have what are called mirror neurons. And these are the neurons that fire specifically when we are seeing somebody perform a given act or behavior. So it's almost like when we watch somebody do something, we're kind of performing the mental reps ourselves to see, oh, can I do that too? If you're watching basketball on TV and you see Steph Curry make a shot, and then you decide, oh, I'm going to go out in the backyard, I'm going to go out in the driveway and put up shots, maybe your mirror neurons were firing, then you're like, yeah, let's go try that. And this allows us to engage in really important social things like imitation. And I don't mean just copying people. Like, we learn by imitating others. We learn simply from observing others, which we'll talk about in chapter 5. And then you also have this element of social perception, knowing how to think about social situations. So here is kind of the basic structure of any neuron. They may not necessarily all look like this, but they're going to have relatively the same structure. You have the cell body, or otherwise known as the soma, where you have the nucleus, the mitochondria, all those important things that power the cell itself. Branching from the cell body are dendrites. These are used to receive information from a neighboring cell or neighboring neuron. The axon, also connecting to the cell body, is used to relay information from one neuron to the next. So axons speak, dendrites listen. Axons deliver the message, dendrites receive the message. The axon, maybe you've noticed, is kind of covered in this translucent thing here called the myelin sheath. And it allows for the impulse or the neuron to fire at a faster, more efficient pace. And actually, if you're not familiar with the neuromuscular disorder, multiple sclerosis or MS, what it does is it prevents the myelination or depletes the myelination of nerve cells, which lead to many of the symptoms that people with MS encounter. So when we say neurons fire, what we're really talking about is a neural impulse. And so this is what we mean by the neurochemical process that's taking place in your nerve cells. We have, when a cell is at rest, you have negatively charged ions inside, you have positively charged ions on the outside. These are just some terms from chemistry. Maybe you're familiar with, maybe not. Honestly, not the most important thing, but just kind of understanding at a basic level what's happening with these neurons. At the moment, they are polarized, meaning, the positively charged ions are on the outside, negatively charged ions on the inside. So you have an imbalance in terms of the charges. That's when a neuron is at rest. Its resting potential is kind of the energy level before it fires, and typically we might even see it's in the negative. What happens when a neuron fires, that membrane we saw on the previous slide here is becomes semi-permeable, which allows for those ions to swap through ion channels. So we have these positive sodium ions, we have I believe we have potassium and sodium ions, and through the process of firing, they're all swapping places. They're depolarizing because the channels open up and the neuron becomes depolarized. And the fancy word for saying a neuron fires is action potential. The ion exchanges along the length of the axon, and that's really, it's a chemical reaction is what we're saying when a neuron fires. And each neuron has a certain threshold that has to fire in order to get the neuron to fire. But this is only looking at neurons like in the singularity. We're talking about billions of neurons firing at any given time. So this is only a single neuron, but imagine this is happening for millions or even billions of neurons at any given moment. So, and it's kind of that threshold, all or nothing. The ion, or excuse me, the nerve cell receives the right amount of stimulation or it doesn't. That's the only thing that generates a fire. So I mentioned earlier in a couple slides ago that you have the dendrites, the axons are communicating together. And in the picture I showed you previously, it looks like they are like intertwined and touching, but actually they're not. They're incredibly, incredibly close without actually touching. There is a very, very tiny gap between the two nerve cells called the synapse. And the synapse is that little cleft or that gap where when one neuron fires, the axon fires to the other dendrite. Across that gap, neurotransmitters are sent. And that's, when we say axons speak, dendrites listen, neurotransmitters are the language in which they're using to speak. They are the chemicals being fired from one neuron to another. So you have the synapse, you have this vesicle holding on to these neurotransmitters, the gap in between, the synaptic gap. We have neurotransmitters that fire. So you can kind of follow this visually. And those neurotransmitters will go to a specific receptor site. So dopamine will go to a dopamine site, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Okay. And what happens, any excess neurotransmitters are reabsorbed in the reuptake process to use for later. When I say neurotransmitters, these are the electrochemical signals. These neurotransmitters are what carrying information from one neuron to the next across the synaptic gap. Some you might be familiar with, some maybe not, but you have acetylcholine or ACH. It regulates muscle action, learning, memory, very important. What's interesting though, is if you are bitten by a black widow spider, it actually increases your acetylcholine levels and leads to paralysis. Alzheimer's disease is actually a reflection of not enough acetylcholine. So you'll notice in some of these examples, these neurotransmitters are the balance is very precarious. A little too much, a little too little can have tremendous effect on our health, our behavior, our way of thinking, etc. You have GABA. GABA is something that it's actually an inhibitor. It prevents other neurons from firing, and it's meant to bring relief from anxiety because we know that low levels of GABA, for example, are associated with higher levels of anxiety. Glutamate. It is an excitatory neurotransmitter, means it speeds things up. It's associated with learning and memory, very important for human development. Also, the lack thereof or too much is involved in many psychological disorders. As you'll find out, a lot of these neurotransmitters are the fine line between being mentally healthy and not really comes down to these various neurotransmitters. Norepinephrine is what your body uses for dealing with stress, for dealing with going into fight or flight. But in small doses, it's fine. When we have too much of it, it actually can lead to elevated levels of stress and can lead to the experiences of mania. Not enough is associated with depression. So again, very fine balance. And it regulates sleep, also works in conjunction with acetylcholine. So you can see how these two neurotransmitters, too much, too little, one or the other can lead to all kinds of consequences. Dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter, also regulates voluntary muscle movement, reward anticipation, like when we know we're about to do something pleasurable, like eat our favorite food, or we just got a text from our person we're maybe romantically interested in, or just a friend, whatever. Those things kind of spike dopamine. They make us feel good. There are stimulant drugs that attempt to activate those dopamine receptors, like cocaine, methamphetamines, things like that. So it's no wonder those drugs are very powerful and also very addictive, because they spike dopamine levels. What's interesting is not enough dopamine is associated with Parkinson's disease. Too much dopamine is associated with schizophrenia. So again, a very fine line. Serotonin, another feel-good drug. It is also involved in the regulation of sleep, mood, attention, and learning. We know a lot about depression being linked to serotonin. Too much or not enough serotonin is linked to depression. Medications like Prozac, SSRIs are intended to regulate the amount of serotonin in the brain through the reuptake process, so they will actually increase serotonin levels. Endorphins are your body's natural ability to heal itself. They are your body's natural opiates, and they allow us, anytime the body is healing or recovering, endorphins can be used to kind of block out some of those pains. And so, these are really effective. There's a reason why we don't feel every single nick, cut, bruise, wear and tear on the body. It's because we have endorphins. I mean, obviously some things we can't avoid as far as pain goes. But a lot of our pain, kind of various day-to-day pains, can be regulated by endorphins. Oxytocin is also, it's a neurotransmitter and a hormone. Hormones come from the endocrine system. Neurotransmitters come from the brain. And this is connected to lactation in new mothers, promoting bonding for new mothers. It's called the cuddle hormone. We get spikes in oxytocin when we're close. We have attachment, we have emotional bonds with other people, especially loved ones. It doesn't have to necessarily be romantic people. It could be familial, it could be friends, but it might also be impacted by just forming emotional bonds with anybody. Drugs a lot of times they can mimic or block various neurotransmitters. You have agonists, or ones that either mimic or enhance neurotransmitters effects. You have antagonists that might block the effects of neurotransmitters. So the things that we consume, whether they're prescribed drugs, illegal drugs, food, all kinds of things, will oftentimes interfere or mimic or distort or block any number of things when it comes to our neurotransmitters. And every neurotransmitter has a specific pathway, as we saw in that picture of the synapse. So dopamine neurotransmitters are going to go on a pathway for dopamine to a dopamine receptor site. Same thing with serotonin. They're going to go to specific places. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump that far ahead, but it's almost like a lock and a key. Not every key is going to work in every lock. Like your house key is only going to unlock your house door. It's not going to unlock your car door. Same thing with these neurotransmitters. Serotonin is going to take the serotonin pathway and go to the serotonin receptor site. Same thing with dopamine. These neurons are deeply interconnected. So far, we've kind of only been focusing on one single neuron, but remember, there are billions, almost 100 billion neurons in the human brain, and they are all interconnected. And this is just kind of a small example of what that might look like in terms of the interconnectedness. We have five different neurons, but I don't even have the number ahead of me, but look at all the different possibilities of connections along the way. Multiply that again by 100 billion, there you go. It's incredible. And this integration allows us to understand and integrate sensory input from our environment. We're going to spend more time on that in chapter 3, and also relating to our motor output. How do we react to that sensory input? This is also linked to where we store information, which we'll spend more time talking about in chapter 6, that you don't have like a single neuron or connection that stores like memories and things. It is distributed throughout this very integrated network of hundreds of billions of neurons. So how do we study the brain? For the longest time, before we had the technology to do so, a lot about what we know about the brain comes from studying brain lesions or destruction to parts of the brain. Sometimes that would happen either by accident. Let's say if somebody, took a blow to the head, or some kind of surgical procedure led to damage to the brain or something like that. We could study those things like as a case study, if you remember from chapter 1. And in some cases you might even, let's say, working with non-human participants, you might even develop techniques where you might destroy parts of the brain to kind of see what's really going on there in the relationship. So some can be naturally occurring. Some of those can be induced. We also have electrical recordings through like the electroencephalograph, where you put the little tabs all over someone's brain and it's literally picking up the electricity that's going through your brain. And putting out those kind of the amplitude, the waves of the brain. It's a single unit recording, so we can study neurons, we can study parts of the brain and really focus in on things. But as technology has evolved, we now have ways to actually create images of the brain, very accurate images of the brain. You can go through X-ray, which might look like something like this, which gives you a certain image. Obviously, a CAT scan or a CT scan might give you a little more nuance, a little closer up to kind of see what's going on. PET scans, same thing. It depends on the kind of questions you're trying to answer. You have MRI machines would probably give you maybe the most detailed picture. Also, we have fMRIs as well, functional magnetic resonance image or resonance image. So again, it depends on, the access to technology, depends on the kind of questions you're attempting to answer, but each one of these different, brain imaging techniques allows us to see the brain in different ways. That was absolutely not possible, not that long ago when we think about, studying the human brain. We also have the TMS system, transcranial stimulation, magnetic stimulation. That's a pretty newer form that's kind of taking on more of a role in brain imaging. So it's constantly evolving. So now if we think about, the nervous system, now we've talked about the small parts. Now we're getting into the larger parts. We're going to look at the brain itself. The brain can be divided up into kind of 3 sections: forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. Forebrain is the most recently developed in terms of evolutionary history. The hindbrain is what connects directly to the spinal cord. So first slide, we got the forebrain. This is the most developed, is the evolutionary center, kind of the newest part of the brain. You have the midbrain, it's in the center of the brain. It's usually involved in things like emotion, memory, things like that. And the hindbrain, basic life functions, the stuff we absolutely need to live. So you could actually theoretically destroy all of this stuff in the brain and still technically be alive, albeit your quality of life would be quite low, as long as you still have the hindbrain around to keep your heart beating. So the hindbrain towards the bottom, we have the brain stem, which connects to the spinal cord. Obviously, damage to this would be literally deadly. You have part of this, the brainstem. You have the medulla, kind of hard to see here, but there's a little bulge here. It controls breathing, regulates your instinctual reflexes. So very important. Breathing, obviously, very important. You have the pons at the kind of closer to the top of the brainstem, and these regulate sleep and arousal, whether you're awake, alert, or not. The cerebellum, in Latin for tiny brain, this regulates motor movement. Actually, this is where you have memory of muscle. This is where you, quote unquote, store muscle memory. So the fact that you can put on your shoe, tie it without even thinking about it, it's stored here in the cerebellum. It also regulates social thinking and behavior in social settings. We have the midbrain, much more central. You have the reticular formation, this kind of bundle of neurons here. It's involved with stereotypical behavior patterns, things we do quite regularly. Walking for one of those. As human beings, as bipeds, we have to walk a lot. So it's going to regulate things like that. We get into the forebrain. This is some of the newest stuff in terms of like evolutionary history of the brain. You have the limbic system, which regulates emotion, memory. Anytime you see the word limbic, think memory and emotion. You have the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. It regulates, intense emotions, the emotions we might necessarily need for survival, anger, things that, emotional awareness, expression, things like that, fear, anger, things that might keep us alive. The hippocampus regulates explicit memory. So remember, the cerebellum down here regulates muscle memory. The hippocampus regulates other memories. So like, the memory of this lecture when you're done, when you're going to take your quiz, your memory of your 5th birthday party, your memory of what you did yesterday, all of those things are regulated by the hippocampus, which actually means seahorse in Greek, if that helps you remember. Somewhat of a pun intended. We also have the thalamus right here. It is a relay. Sorry, my little fitness app is going off. The thalamus is a relay station for all sensory information. So we encounter sensory information with those sensory neurons. That relays information to the thalamus, which distributes it to the rest of the brain. And then finally, not finally, sorry, I have a couple more. I was thinking there was only a couple more left, but there is. The basal ganglia, voluntary muscle movement. So any kind of coordinated muscle movement, dancing, sports, anything like that, rhythmic, you're going to need to use the basal ganglia. The hypothalamus, which means below the thalamus. This is regulating all of the things that you need to survive as a human being. So eating, drinking, sex, sleep, the basic things you need to sleep to use to survive as a human being, sorry. Regulates your internal state, your homeostasis as well. So very important for being alive. It also regulates emotion, stress, reward. That experience of pleasure. So the hypothalamus, very important. Take a look at these different brains. We have a rat here, a cat, a chimp, and we have a human. Try to look and just maybe pause the video if you'd like for a moment and see what kind of structures are similar and maybe what's different. And if you want to pause and kind of stop and think about it first, I'll give you a sec and come back. Okay, hopefully you paused and you've come back. You can kind of see that all of these species have a brainstem, they have the cerebellum, they have the cortex, they have they have the cerebral cortex, this bundle of the bundle of fibers that allow us, for advanced thinking. But look at the difference between, let's say, a rat and a cat, their cerebellum, their cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex of a cat and a chimp, of a human. The development you can see it in terms of the size and the fissures. Brain size isn't the be all end all in terms of intelligence. It is really the development of the cerebral cortex that is indicative of intelligence. So kind of as it develops more and more, we can see the advancement of intelligence across species. And so each brain is kind of developed, or for lack of a better term, designed. I don't really mean design. There's a designer out there. In terms of like evolutionary design, is intended to promote survival of each species. So they have evolved over time to promote survival for each species. The cerebral cortex is the most advanced portion of the brain. It is the outermost layer, sometimes referred to as the neocortex. It is divided into 4 lobes. You have the occipital lobe in the back, which regulates vision. You have the temporal lobe on the side, regulates hearing, language, memory. And the frontal lobe, intelligence, voluntary muscle movement, personality, planning, lots of stuff goes into the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe kind of at the top, but more towards the back. Space, touch, motor movement, very, very important. So these are the most recent developed portions of the brain in terms of our evolutionary history. But they are the parts of the brain that allow for advanced cognition, things like that. If we look at the lobes more specifically, we look at the cerebral cortex, we can see a couple of other specific cortex along the top, kind of middle towards the back. You have the somatosensor or the motor cortex here, which regulates motor movement. And along the cortex, you have different parts of the body that are kind of mapped out on this cortex. So for example, right around here regulates the experience of swallowing. So if this part of the brain were stimulated maybe by an electrical impulse, you might start to swallow without even necessarily knowing why. The lobe, or excuse me, the cortex behind that is called the somatosensory cortex, and it's our experience of touch. And every part of the body is mapped out onto the somatosensory cortex. And certain parts of our body are more susceptible to touch, meaning we feel touch more. There's more touch receptors, more receptors for that experience of touch. They take up more space on the somatosensory cortex. So somatosensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. it regulates body sensations and touch. The motor, it's in the frontal lobe, regulates voluntary movement. The association cortex, 75% of the overall cortex is just relating all of this stuff together. Like, again, we don't just use 10% of your brain. I mean, even like, it's very rarely, if ever, are you using just a single part of the brain. It's all of this stuff is being used in various ways in any given activity. So not just sensory or motor information, but integrating all of that complex, 100 billion plus, neurons working together seamlessly. That's part of the association cortex, that integration. More areas of the brain you should be familiar with, especially on the left side of the brain, the left cerebral cortex. You have Broca's area, kind of close to that temporal lobe, and then you have Wernicke's area. Broca's area, is responsible for regulating speech. So Broca, the Spanish word for mouth, is boca, kind of sounds familiar. So Broca, you use your mouth to create speech. Wernicke's area is for speech comprehension. The fact that you can understand what I'm saying right now, the fact that I don't sound like Charlie Brown's teacher, womp, 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 Wernicke's area is working just fine. The two hemispheres of the brain are divided by the corpus callosum. It is a bundle of fibers that, again, keeps the two sides together. And actually, there's some really phenomenal research that shows, called split brain research, exploring what happens when individuals have to have that bundle of nerves severed. In fact, people who suffer from seizures, and if they have epilepsy and they're having lots of grand mal seizures and they aren't responding to medication or other treatments, you might undergo a split brain procedure, because the idea is during epilepsy, you have these electrochemical events firing back and forth between the two hemispheres, too much to the point where seizures are happening. Well, if we stop that we can sever the corpus callosum. And for the most part, people live a fairly normal life. You kind of think, wow, you split the brain in half, you'd think that would kill somebody. Actually, it doesn't. There are some kind of quirks that might take place, but for the most part, people can live a fairly normal life with their corpus callosum severed. So anyways, you can read about a case study about WJ in your textbook. All right, so the hemispheres, this does not mean you are left brain or right brain. It just means that certain functions have specialized on either the left or right. Your left hemisphere is typically known for verbal processing, for speech, for grammar, whereas the right hemisphere is more for nonverbal, spatial perception, visual recognition, motions, things like that. So, but that does not mean you are left or right brain. Just because you're good at math doesn't mean you're this or that. There's no evidence that suggests there's any such thing as being left or right brain. So our information, in terms of how we process information, we are bilaterally symmetrical. So information that enters the left visual field will be processed on the right side of your body, or the right side of your brain, and vice versa. That is really kind of it in a nutshell. The nervous system, the brain, neurons, all that good stuff. It's a very fast form of communication. This is very different from the endocrine system, which is a kind of a slower form of communication. We have various glands throughout the body that regulate behavior, mental processes by secreting hormones directly into the bloodstream. So you have some examples might be the hypothalamus, which I mentioned with the brain. It is both limbic, or it's both part of the nervous system and the endocrine. The pituitary gland, thyroid, pancreas, ovaries for women, testes for men. These are various hormone producing glands that can affect behavior, albeit in a more slow kind of route than the nervous system. Okay. Let's see. Hormones, they're chemical messengers. They're just not electrochemical. And in the bloodstream, it's a slow. Sorry, I'm like, this is the first time I'm giving this presentation, so I kind of forget where the setups are. So my apologies. But it's interconnected with the nervous system through the autonomic nervous system. So go back a few slides if you're unfamiliar with what the autonomic nervous system is. The endocrine system, again, slow, but some examples of important usage of this system. You have the adrenal glands. They sit atop of your kidneys. They regulate things like mood and energy, especially when you're coping with stressful events. They produce epinephrine and norepinephrine in the bloodstream, which regulates your experience of fight or flight. The pancreas produces digestive hormones, including insulin, so very important for health, wellness. ovaries and testes. These are the hormones that are involved in sexual maturation, sexual development, reproduction, allows us to keep the species going. One of the cool things I think we have learned over the years is that, you know, the brain is not finite in terms of like what you're born with is what you get. It used to be believed like, okay, if you damage the brain or, you know, lose neurons or anything like that, you're stuck. But what we're learning now is the brain is actually malleable even throughout our life. It becomes less malleable as we get older, but we can actually recover from brain damage. But it does depend on a number of factors, including the age. Younger people tend to respond better. The extent of the damage, obviously more severe damage, it's going to be harder to recover from. What sort of interventions can be used? You know, but we've made so many gains in this area compared to even years past. And what we see is the brain, when it damages, will even sprout new neurons. This is called collateral sprouting. And so if certain parts of the brain are damaged, they might compensate in other areas by sprouting more connections to neighboring neurons. And through those sprouting and those new connections, you might actually see substitution of functioning. Like we can see this with patients who undergo, you know, if they're undergoing phantom limb pain, for example, phantom limb syndrome, if they lose a limb, but then they feel the existence of that missing limb when they touch another part of their body, it might, you know, kind of substitute the function. But we now know there is this process of neurogenesis where new neurons can actually regenerate. We used to, you know, think that it didn't happen at all. It is limited. It's not like you can just grow a whole new brain, but we know that, for example, like the hippocampus, we can grow new neurons, and the hippocampus are the place that regulates memory. So the more we understand about the brain, the better. One of the most interesting kind of ways to study brain damage is through concussions. You know, athletes, not just athletes, but that's kind of the easiest way to look at it. But these are considered mild traumatic brain injuries that might result in temporary loss of brain functioning. And some ways to do, you know, to kind of treat that. You know, in very serious cases, you have brain tissue implants where you can graft, you can use the development of stem cells, although albeit that is somewhat controversial, politically speaking. Okay, last kind of topic I want to mention before, you know, when we think about, you know, the role, we think about, you know, biology and behavior and what role that plays in thinking and behavior. If we go to the finest level, you know, a lot of our behavior, the way we think, can be studied at the level of genetics by studying things like chromosomes, the genes we inherit from our parents, the DNA, you know, the set of blueprints that we're given, passed on from, you know, your biological mom, biological father. That's information that's passed on and can have a powerful impact on the way we think, the way we behave. And a lot of what we understand about genetics and behavior comes from a wonderful project, I believe it's ongoing project called the Human Genome Project, which is attempting to map the human genetic sequence. And it helps us to understand, for example, like passing on certain traits through the dominant recessive gene principle. If you remember studying Gregor Mendel, maybe in like 7th grade biology, hopefully some of that is familiar. And we can really study genetics at a molecular level and really understand at a nitty gritty, like how this stuff is impacting our behavior. And some of this information has been used, not necessarily with humans, but selective breeding in terms of animals, understanding the role for genetics, you know, what sort of characteristics we might want to breed for when it comes to like animal rearing. And understanding, you know, like the connections, the genome wide, like looking at how these genomes spread across, you know, different individuals and what happens, what accounts for, you know, changes. And we can study a lot about the impact of genetics with adoption studies by studying people who might share the same genetic material, identical twins, and study them in different settings, especially those who have been put up for adoption. So one of the main ideas from studying genetics is the dominant recessive principle. So if one gene, you know, if you have a pair of genes, you know, that you inherit, one is dominant, one is recessive, the dominant one overrides the recessive gene. And so we think about things like height or eye color, hair color, things like that. And so you inherit one set of characteristics from your biological mother, one from your father. One tends to be dominant, the other tends to be recessive. A recessive gene only exerts its influence if both are recessive. So for example, we know that eye color, a blue eye color is a recessive gene. So, you know, if you have a mom who has brown eyes, dad who has blue eyes, typically the dominant color will win out. In this case, the brown eyes will win out. But if both parents had blue eyes, that would greatly increase the likelihood that the child themselves has blue eyes, in this case, the recessive trait. But when we think about complex traits like eye color, not that, I mean, it is complex, but not as complex as, let's say, like whether you are an extrovert or an introvert. That's very complex. And that we would say is not influenced by a single trait, but it is polygenic, meaning it is influenced by multiple traits. And last thing, you inherit a certain genetic sequence from your parents. Like you have a genotype, and it is what you inherit, biologically inherit. But who you are is not just your genes. It is a combination of your genetics plus the effects of experience, like the environment you grew up in, the schools you grow, the neighborhood you live in, the friends you have, all of those things factor into it. And that is what leads to your phenotype, what you actually express. You might inherit certain characteristics from your parents, like maybe your parents, maybe you're kind of anxious or depressed. But if you are in the right environment, maybe where all of your mental health needs are being met, maybe you never express those traits of being anxious or depressed. Or think of it this way: if both of your parents are athletic, maybe your dad played basketball, mom played softball, and you would think that means, okay, well, I have the genetics to be really athletic, and maybe you do. But if, let's say, you're not in the right environment, maybe you don't express those genes. Maybe if instead of being put around sports equipment, you're given an instrument to play. Maybe your parents are like, I want you to learn an instrument instead. So maybe then you don't actually display the genetics of being a really good athlete. So just something to think about. Environment matters. Environment affects, who you are is a combination of your genetics plus your environment. So that's going to be it for chapter 2. We are going to come back for chapter 3, another sort of anatomy laden chapter, but this time we're going to look at sensation and perception, looking at the anatomy of the ear, the eye, and much more. So stick around, and I'll see you next time for chapter 3. Peace.